The house doesn't exist on any map. It isn't listed in town records, and no one can recall when it was built. But everyone in the nearby village knows the stories. Those who step inside never leave the same. Some never leave at all. They say on quiet nights, you can hear the whispers of those trapped inside, begging for a salvation that will never come. It wasn't the kind of place Clara and Noah wanted to find, but the house wanted to find them. It began on a quiet evening when Clara and her brother Noah decided to take a detour through the woods on their way home. The road was narrow, the trees arched overhead, forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. As they drove, the engine sputtered and died, leaving them stranded near a decaying wooden house that seemed to watch them with shadowed, empty windows. Clara, clutching her flashlight, persuaded Noah to seek help at the house. The air grew colder as they approached, and the wooden steps creaked loudly under their weight. Inside, the house smelled of rot and dust, and the walls were covered with peeling wallpaper revealing claw-like patterns. A faint hum seemed to resonate through the floorboards. As they explored, a low, guttural noise echoed through the house, freezing them in their tracks. It came from the basement. Despite Noah's protests, Clara insisted they investigate. The basement door was ajar, revealing stairs descending into an abyss of darkness. The hum grew louder, almost like whispering voices calling their names. At the bottom, they found a room filled with mirrors of all shapes and sizes. Each mirror reflected not their own images, but twisted versions of themselves, Clara with hollow eyes, Noah with an impossibly wide grin. One mirror showed a shadowed figure standing behind them, but when they turned, nothing was there. In the far corner of the basement was a heavy iron door, covered in rust and ancient symbols. The whispers became deafening as Clara reached for the handle. Noah tried to pull her back, but she was compelled to open it. Behind the door was a corridor that defied logic. It twisted and turned, growing narrower with each step, as if the walls were closing in. At the end of the corridor, they entered a cavernous room, unlike anything they'd ever seen. The walls dripped with black tar-like substance. In the center was an altar, and on it sat a book bound in flesh, pulsating like it had a heartbeat. As Clara approached, a shadowed entity emerged from the walls, tall, faceless, and wreathed in smoke. It spoke without words, filling their minds with unbearable screams. The entity revealed that the house was a trap, feeding on the souls of those who wandered too close. Clara and Noah were next. The book opened itself, pages flipping violently as grotesque images and symbols glowed. Desperate, they ran, the walls twisting and the floor crumbling beneath them. They burst out of the house just as it began to collapse in on itself. The forest was silent again, the oppressive canopy above gone. Their car started without issue, as though nothing had happened. But as they drove away, Clara noticed the rearview mirror. The shadowed entity was sitting in the back seat. Days later, Clara woke in her bed to find dirt under her fingernails and the faint sound of whispers coming from her closet. Noah was never seen again. Clara tried to convince herself it was all a nightmare, but the evidence was undeniable. Every night the whispers returned, louder and closer. One evening, as she checked her closet, she found something horrifying. A single rusty nail embedded in the wood, oozing black tar. Beside it was a piece of paper, aged and torn, with scrawled writing that read, "He's watching. Always." Clara began to see things out of the corner of her eye. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Figures lurking just outside the edges of her vision. One night, while brushing her teeth, her bathroom mirror began to fog unnaturally. A single word appeared, written from the inside of the mirror: "Run." Driven to the brink of insanity, Clara decided to investigate her home for clues. She climbed into the attic, a place she had avoided since moving in. Among the dusty boxes and cobwebs, she found something horrifying. A small wooden doll, carved crudely, with a twisted face that bore a striking resemblance to Noah. Its body was nailed to a piece of old wood, and its eyes seemed to follow her. Beneath it lay the same flesh-bound book from the house, now covered in dust, but pulsating faintly, as though it was alive. Convinced that the only way to end this nightmare was to confront the source, Clara drove back to the house in the woods. The structure now looked even more decayed, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. She noticed symbols carved into the trees leading up to the house, each glowing faintly with an eerie green light. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, and the whispers became screams. The house seemed alive, reshaping itself as Clara moved through it. Hallways twisted, rooms appeared where there were none before. At the heart of the house, she found the shadowed entity waiting for her. Its form was more distinct now, tall and skeletal, with glowing cracks running through its body, revealing a seething darkness within. It raised one clawed hand, and Clara was paralyzed. "You brought him here," it whispered. "Now you'll stay in his place." The entity revealed that Noah had made a deal to save Clara that night at the house. In exchange for her freedom, he had offered his soul. But now, the entity had grown hungry again, and demanded another soul. It offered her a choice: bring someone else to the house, or stay forever. Clara tried to resist, but the entity placed its clawed hand over her chest, and she felt her heartbeat slowing, her vision dimming. "You will choose," it hissed. Desperate and terrified, Clara agreed to bring another soul to the house. She returned to the woods and planted a handwritten sign near the road. "Car trouble? Knock for help." She felt the entity watching her from the treetops, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Days passed before she saw headlights approaching. A young couple, laughing and unaware, stopped to read the sign. Clara stepped into the shadows and whispered, "Forgive me." Clara fled as the couple entered the house, their laughter turning to screams moments later. She tried to live a normal life, but it was impossible. She woke every night at 3:33 a.m., her hands covered in blood she couldn't explain, and the whispers louder than ever. One night, she saw Noah's face in the mirror, his eyes hollow and his mouth open in a silent scream. "You didn't save me," he mouthed. Clara realized too late that the entity had tricked her. She was not free, it had only bound her closer. Every few nights she found herself back at the woods, luring another victim. The house consumed her mind, and she became its servant. One evening, a stranger knocked on her door. It was Noah. But he wasn't human anymore. His face was stretched, his eyes black as coal, and he smiled with jagged teeth. "Your turn, Clara," he whispered. The story ends with Clara's scream fading into the night as the house in the woods waits patiently for its next visitor. The house remains at the edge of the woods, its doors open, waiting. The whispers never stop, luring the curious, the desperate, and the lost.